Hey, as mentioned earlier, we started this message series on this topic of hospitality. And this word hospitality is actually something that's so instructive. And in many ways, it embodies what the Christian faith is all about. So if you're someone who's new to faith or someone who you just came because a friend invited you, this is really a great series to come to because it really gets at the heart of what Christians believe about the ways that we're supposed to interact with the world. And it actually comes from this word of hospitality. And so the passage that was just read for us earlier was this passage that Paul writes to the early church in Rome. Now, check out what Paul writes. Look at what he says. And think about the moral virtue that Paul is talking about here. Look at what Paul says. He says, love must be sincere. Hate what is evil, cling to what is good, be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves. Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. Share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. High five your neighbor and say, practice hospitality. That's right. Now, keep in mind, this text and even this moral vision, I mean, just think about it. Like, even what he's talking about, of love being sincere, of hating what is evil, of practicing hospitality, this kind of posture is something so different than the ways of the world that we live in even today. Now, imagine, Paul is writing this to the church in Rome in antiquity, though. Now, notice this word actually for the word hospitality, it shows up in different letters that are written by the early church leaders. This word for hospitality is the word philoxenia. Can I hear you say philoxenia? That's right. Brooklyn actually brought up this word yesterday when talking about the parable of Jesus, where he talks about this theme of hospitality. Now, this word philoxenia is actually a compound word. It's a combination of these two words together. Now, some of you may or may not be aware of some of these Greek words, but you probably have some sort of inkling towards this. So philoxenia, the word philo comes from this word phileo, which is the word for love. So for instance, there's like this city, second-class city called Philadelphia. The city of brotherly love, right? Where does that come from? Well, Philadelphia, philo, love. So phileo or philoxenia, that word philo is this word for love. Now, xenia is this word for xenos, which is the word for stranger. So when Paul is basically saying philoxenia, he's saying practice hospitality. What he's talking about is have love for the stranger. Now, today, in today's world, most of us, when we think of this word hospitality, we think of, it's basically a time and space for me to host people, to invite people over to my place, or to meet at a local shop or coffee shop or whatever, and to extend hospitality to the people that I love. But here, do you see, even embedded in this word is something so different. It's so extra. So unusual for even the world that we live in. It's a love that actually extends beyond. It actually goes towards the stranger. Christine Pohl, who's actually a historian and a scholar, she wrote this book years ago, and it's this book called Making Room. And she actually covers how this word for hospitality, philoxenia, it actually encompasses not only what the scriptures teach in the Hebrew Old Testament and also in the Greek New Testament, but also in the history of the church, this word philoxenia or hospitality was what marked the early Christian church. Now you gotta keep in mind that Christians, it's not like Christianity was some kind of known thing. It was actually this small minority religion in the Roman Empire. And so when people would talk about Jesus and Jesus being Lord, everyone's like, what? Some no-name Jewish carpenter against Rome where Caesar is Lord? And yet the early Christians were a people who practiced hospitality. And so what Christine Pohl outlines is how throughout the history of the church, this theme of hospitality, of extending to the other, is so part of the Christian message and the Christian story. Now, in fact, on the cover of her book is actually a mosaic that actually comes to us from the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore, and it's actually in Rome, Italy. Now, this actual mosaic is actually a mosaic of Abraham in Genesis chapter 18, the story of Abraham extending hospitality to three strangers. And it's a mark of Abraham and the culture of a faith that has always been marked by this theme of hospitality that we are to carry. Now, this mosaic was created in the 5th century. But see, this story of extending hospitality, and you can see in this fresco, it's actually Sarah and Abraham preparing bread for these strangers. Now, and that's from the story in Genesis chapter 18. See, but throughout the early church, this idea of philoxenia was was part of the Christian witness because Christians were just a small, no-name group of people. And so there's actually this letter that was written by Dionysius, who is actually a bishop of Alexandria in northern Africa in the early church in the 3rd century. Now, you got to keep in mind, in the 3rd century, Christendom hadn't appeared yet. Christians were still a persecuted minority. It was so easy to get snuffed out because these were unschooled, ordinary people talking about Jesus as Lord. And Rome is like, what? Seriously, Christians? Who the heck do you think you are? You are nobodies. And yet, somehow, the Christian movement grew even in this context. Now, here's what's so stunning, is Dionysius actually writes a letter outlining what Christians were known for and how they behaved in the midst of bloody persecution. So you can imagine, Christians were dying for their faith. Their families are dying for their faith. And not only that, an epidemic, a plague would come upon the Roman Empire in northern Africa, as well as regions of Rome and in the Roman Empire. And this plague, this epidemic would end up befalling so many people that people were dying and getting sick. Now, keep in mind though, Dionysius writes about how did Christians behave in the aftermath of persecution as well as an epidemic and a plague that would come upon the Roman Empire. Here's what Dionysius writes from the 3rd century. He writes, most of our brother Christians showed unbounded love and loyalty, never sparing themselves and thinking only of one another. Heedless of the danger, they took charge of the sick, attending to their every need and ministering to them in Christ, and with them departed this life serenely happy. What? This is what Christians did? They cared for the sick? This is what they were known for? For they were infected by others with the disease, much to the harm of themselves, drawing on themselves the sickness of their neighbors and cheerfully accepting their pains. Many, in nursing and curing others, transferred their death to themselves and died in their stead. This is what Christians were known for. The best of our brothers lost their lives in this manner. A number of presbyters, deacons, and laymen winning high commendation, so that death in this form, the result of great piety and strong faith, seems in every way the equal of martyrdom. Now, here's what historians have observed about the early church. Because how did the early church grow when they were just a small, easily snuffed out minority? They grew because of philoxenia. Because of a love that would belie the ways of the world. A love that extended to the sick and to the hurting and to the other. Now, that is stunning because it wasn't like some slick marketing campaign, a beautiful website, great social media presence. Like being kind of this cool church that serves granola bars every week. There was none of that. It was the texture of philoxenia. The ways that somehow Christians embody a kind of love, a kind of ethic that would be so different than the ways of the world. A love that would extend in this manner. Now, isn't this stunning? That this is what the early Christian church was known for. And yet today, there's actually a word that's popular in today's culture. In fact, many would actually say that a lot of Christians exhibit this other word that you don't even have to know Greek, but you've probably heard this word before. It's the word xenophobia. Anyone heard this word? Now, keep in mind, xenophobia actually comes from these same it's a compound word, xenos, which is stranger, and phobia, fear of, the fear of strangers. Now, isn't that interesting how different then the posture can be? There's philoxenia, which is love of strangers, which is what the early church, like the Apostle Paul and what Jesus would talk about time and time again, that we are to be a people of hospitality, of philoxenia, and yet somehow xenophobia is kind of the rule of the land today, even amongst the church. That somehow when it comes to the foreigners and the strangers and to others, xenophobia can be what many of us are marked by. Now, I recognize this reality is even true for myself. Because for me, there's the people, of course, that I love and that I want to be with all the time. Then there's kind of on this sliding scale, then there's the people that I kind of like, we're blood relatives. I'm okay seeing them at holidays and stuff. Then there's the people who like kind of further down the scale where there's these people that just, they're blood relatives, but let's be honest, they're kind of annoying. Like, I'm not gonna sit next to them at the dinner table when we're together. I'm gonna try to avoid them a little bit. Now, here's what's so stunning. It's like, just think about this whole sliding scale. And at the end of this spectrum of the scale is philoxenia, a love of strangers. Now, here's what's interesting, right? Because xenophobia is such a fear of the other, and yet the Christian ethic was so profoundly different. In Latin, there's actually a couple of words where we get the word hospitality. Now, the word for stranger or guest is actually this word hospice. So in Latin, the word hospice, this is where we get words like hospital from, or hospitality. Now, this word for hospitality for guest or stranger. Now, notice there's actually another word that's actually very similar to this word hospice. It's the word hostes, just one letter different. And it's the word for enemy. We actually get words like hostility from hostes, because we are hostile to our enemies and to those who are different than us. Now, here's the thing, right? There's this fine line between being hospitable towards or being hostile towards. And the reality is, it's easy and it's easier to actually waffle and wade into hostile territory rather than being hospitable. And yet, the early church, and when Paul is talking about practicing hospitality, he's talking about philoxenia, that this is what the church is to be marked by, not by xenophobia, not by hostility, but actually hospitality. What does it look like for each one of us in the areas that we inhabit, in our personal lives, in our families, in our workplaces, in our rooms, with our roommates, in our neighborhoods? Okay, could you imagine if each one of us, like there was kind of this reputation that, oh my goodness, those Christians, they're just so incredible, hospitable. They are a people who philoxenia. They're just kind of their love for even those who are strange or are strangers. It just simply abounds. Now, notice immediately after Paul says this, look at what he writes. He says, practice hospitality. And then he says, bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. High five your neighbor and say, bless those who persecute you. That's right. High five your other neighbor and say, bless and do not curse. Isn't that interesting that philoxenia it's actually combined with this exhortation to be a people of blessing. Now, what is this word blessing? What does it mean to bless those who persecute you? Now, again, on this spectrum, he's saying, hey, just don't bless those people that you want to bless, that somehow you derive some sort of benefit because you've blessed them. It's a way to make friends, or it's simply like, it helps me because these are the people I'm supposed to love. But he actually says, bless those who persecute you. How stunning is that kind of moral vision? Now, this word for bless is actually the word eulogeo. Eulogeo. Now, eulogeo actually comes from two roots. Now, I realize that's a verb, eulogeo, but it comes from these two words, and you might recognize them as well. This word, the beginning is you, which is good. So, for instance, evangelism or evangelist or evangel is basically good news. That's why the Christian message is known as good news. It was this part you. Now, in the same way, eulogeo, logos is this word. It's the noun form of logos, which is word, account, or logic. So eulogeo is basically giving a good word. So when this word bless is used, it's this word that comes up, eulogeo. Now here, let me ask you this question. You don't even need to know Greek, but this word eulogeo, what word does that sound like or look like in English? Eulogy. Isn't that interesting? Now, in what context often are eulogies given? Anyone? Funerals, thank you. Sorry, I realize some of you are like, Drew, you don't normally ask questions like this to us. So like, why do you doing? It's cognitive dissonance, right? I get it. I was just trying to make things more interactive. Yeah, eulogy. We give them at funerals. Now, what's interesting though, this word of blessing, it's bless those who persecute. It doesn't just say, hey, bless the dead and say a good word for them. But it's actually an exhortation to eulogize the living. And in so doing, we are to be a people who eulogize the living. We give a good word, a good account. We speak words of blessing. Whatever environments we go in. Could you imagine people like, if you were known in your workplace, like that person's just full of good words. Well, how different is that kind of presence? To be a people who eulogize the living. In the Harvard Business Review, there was an article that came out in 2021. And it was this article, and it's entitled, "A Simple Compliment Can Make a Big Difference." And now notice what it says. It says, in 2 independently conducted lines of research, we asked participants to estimate how another person would feel after receiving a compliment. So in other words, they asked each one of us, how do you think people will feel if you say a nice word about them? We then asked those same participants to actually compliment another person. And we compared how that person actually felt after receiving the compliment to how participants imagined that person would feel. Using the same basic experimental paradigm, both with friends and strangers, we consistently found that people underestimated how good their compliment would make the recipient feel. Most of us think, it makes no big difference. And yet, what actually happened, the research showed, was that people, they were incredibly thankful for those compliments that were given. Compliment givers tend to believe the other person won't enjoy their interaction as much as they actually do. In other words, we minimize how much compliments and a good word can do. In fact, they often believe that their exchange will probably make the person a little uncomfortable. When I read this, I was like, is this like research that was done with Koreans? I'm just kidding. So I'm Korean American, so yeah, just a little uncomfortable. No. Yet consistently, receiving a compliment brightens people's day much more than anticipated, leaving them feeling better and less uncomfortable than givers expect. Indeed, when asked, nearly 90% of people believe that they should compliment each other more often. I mean, you don't even have to be a Christian here. You're probably like, yep, I think that's true. It'd be good to compliment each other. Now look at what it says. And yet we tend not to give them in practice. In fact, only 50% of people in one experiment who wrote down a compliment for a friend actually sent the compliment along when given the chance, even though they'd already done the hardest part, coming up with something nice to say. That is, despite the widely shared desire to give more compliments, when faced with the decision, people still often forego low-cost opportunities to make others feel appreciated and valued. For whatever reason, we are predisposed to thinking somehow that the eulogies that we give to people, to the living, is not as effective as they can be. And yet, the research has shown that it has remarkable effects. Now, isn't that true? I know that growing up from a background where there weren't a lot of compliments or words of blessing being said to one another, like there's something though about why is it so hard for me just to give words of blessing to people, to speak a good word over them. And yet this is the invitation that we have. And so here's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna invite us, we're gonna practice giving a good word. Now, here's how we're gonna do this. I'm gonna invite you to take out your phones. Now, I recognize some of you already had your phones out because you were fact checking me or whatever. You were, I don't know, wondering about who's playing who this afternoon. I get it. Now listen, take out your phone. I'm gonna invite you to use this sentence stem. And what you're gonna do is you're gonna eulogeo somebody. You're gonna basically give a word of blessing to somebody. And perhaps it's someone that you haven't seen in a while or haven't communicated this in a while. And I'm just gonna invite you. I'm gonna invite you right now. You can go ahead and text the person right now. And here's what you're gonna do. You're gonna text, I appreciate you because, and then you're gonna give a specific reason. I appreciate you because. So I'm gonna just invite you to do that right now. I appreciate you because. Give a word of blessing to someone. Press send if you haven't already. Now, here's what I'd love for you to do. Why don't we just take a moment right now, just turn to the person next to you, and could you just share who you sent a text message to and why? And why? Go ahead and do that. Just share. You can, if you don't know the person next to you, hey, practice hospitality. Philoxenia. Okay, I'm gonna give you 30 more seconds. 30 more seconds. I have a feeling a lot of people said their mom. Now, giving a good word, speaking a word of blessing. But like I mentioned, right, like this passage actually goes extra. It says, it just doesn't say bless those who you forgot to appreciate one day. It actually says bless those who persecute you. Bless them and not curse them. So here's what we're gonna do. Now, listen, I recognize we're not gonna, no text messages here, because I recognize that it'd be incredibly awkward if you texted someone in this room and they, just like, I didn't know I was an enemy, wow, But listen, this is an incredibly hard thing to do, of course, because, philoxenia, that's just, it's ridiculous. It goes against the ways of human culture, the ways that I behave, the way that all the cultures behave. Why? Because we want to love the people that are around us. Now, the word for curse is actually a word for offering like a prayer of condemnation, a prayer of cursing over. And so when we bless someone, what we're doing is we're giving a good word, but we're praying a good word over them. And so here's what I want to invite us to do. I'm going to invite us just over the next moment, if you could think of maybe in your own life, if there's someone that you find disagreeable. And maybe it is someone in this room. Maybe it's me. I don't know. Please. But here's what I want to invite you to do. I want to invite you just to pray a word of blessing over that person. And so here's what we're going to do. Just going to give you a moment of silence to reflect. Don't send a text message. Just anyone that you might consider an enemy or someone who, again, is disagreeable towards you. Someone that, honestly, it's hard to love or hard to actually extend grace and blessing to. And I want to invite us. Here's a sentence stem that I want to invite us to use as you pray this prayer. And it's this. God, please bless this person by, and then share this word of blessing. Now, here's the thing. I recognize that it's easy to pray a prayer of blessing, but it's kind of like a curse. It's like, God, please bless this person by helping them not become a jerk to me anymore, right? It's kind of a blessing, not really. So, but I want us to just think about, just pray a prayer of blessing, that you would want a good word over this person. So I'm just going to invite you right now just to pray this prayer of blessing. Go ahead and pray this prayer right now. Amen. Now, the reality is that's supposed to be incredibly difficult because it's just not the way that we normally function. Why would I pray a blessing over someone when I hate them or they've hurt me in such a manner? And yet, this is what philoxenia looks like. This is what, when Paul, it's writing under this greater tradition. And this is what's so stunning, right? Because it is extra. This moral vision is something that really does feel supernatural. Why would anyone do this? Especially in a city like this, which is full of cursing one another. Why would anyone want to pray blessing when, you know what, I want to bless the people that I love and the people that, my family and whoever else, but to bless people who have hurt me. As I was reading, I was just thinking about just this past week, Tina and I, we've been getting into arguments about back to school materials. And honestly, I don't want to spend more money on pencils. It's only $5.99, but still, there's something principally in me. So Tina and I, and I'm like, okay, what does it mean to philoxenia to Tina right now? And yet the vision of this passage is far greater than that. It's a love for the people who have hurt me, who I consider enemies. Now, where does this come from? See, this is simply in line, though, with the profound moral vision of Jesus. Look at what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5. Jesus says, but I say to you, love your enemies. Say what? Bless those that curse you. Do good to those that hate you. And pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. What a stunning vision. So much of the world today, it's often filled with more rage and more hate and more division than arguably at different moments of human history. With all the advancements that have been made with medicine, technology, and yet somehow, when it comes to the virtues of love and kindness. And Jesus, think about this, thousands of years ago, he gives this profound teaching with this utterly supernatural vision of what love is. See, but here's the thing, right? Is the Christian message just seeped in just this moral code of just hey, love your enemies, you better do it. See, what the earliest Christians believed, though, it was more profound than that. It wasn't simply a teaching or a moral code that we lived by. Paul, who writes about practicing philoxenia, in the same letter to the church in Rome, look at how Paul understood what the Christian experience of love truly is. Look at what he writes. Romans chapter 5, he writes, for if while we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life? See, here's what the earliest Christians believed, that we're not a people who live by just this moral code and this is what we believe and this is why we live this way. Instead, we believe in a God who actually, more than simply teaching such profound truth, would actually live it and embody it in such a manner that the God of the universe, rather than condemn you and xenophobia, you and I, that this God would actually philoxenia us, that this God would actually be a God who loves us, even when we were apart from God, even when we were far off. You see, and what Paul and the other early Christians knew is that our hospitality, our philoxenia, was deeply steeped, not in wanting to follow this moral code, but actually an experience, a profound experience of each one of us having experienced so profoundly the love of God, that because we've experienced a God who would love us like that, that somehow that we would be a people who would be an extension of his love to the world. That a God who, instead of cursing us, would rather bless us. And he would demonstrate this by dying on a cross for us. This is who God is. And this is the invitation for us all. Will you receive that love? Will you allow philoxenia to be true of your own life and heart? And would you allow this to be what marks you in the world that you live in?